Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And we're delighted once again to have Stuart McAllister, the McAllister, the elder and the wiser among us today. So,
Thank you so much for tuning in to Thinking Out Loud. This is a podcast and a ministry where we try to model livable Christian hope. In today's podcast, we begin with a discussion of why you should care about Catholicism in the first place, even if you're not Catholic. And then we move on to talking about the importance of Pope John Paul II. And then we talk a little bit about Catholicism's tensions with the modern world. And as always, we are a listener-supported podcast and indeed ministry. If you would like to support us financially, you can do that by going to www.toltogether.com. Thank you, and we hope this is useful to you.
Stuart, it's great to have you here. And some questions have been being batted around that I think you're uniquely qualified to help us think through. But specifically, I want to talk to you about the value of popes, even for the non-Catholics. And the issue at play here is I think I run around with a lot of people in the Christian world who don't even have a clue who the current pope is, or, why should we care, be interested? It's kind of like, well, who's the president of the Czech Republic right now or whatever. It's just kind of a totally foreign, different outside category to their Christian faith and understanding. And then, obviously the Catholic Church makes the news, or the popes sometimes do. But I was wondering if you could give us as a non-Catholic, but somebody who's read deeply in those categories, a little bit of a, hey, here's maybe a reason why you want to keep an eye on what's going on in the Catholic Church and with the popes in particular, even if you're not a Catholic.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's great to be back with you guys again. And gosh, what an interesting question. I think first of all, I would start with the fact that, of course, I grew up in Scotland as a secular Scotland, but a post-Reformation, which was had a very anti-Catholic bias in it. But then, of course, lived in Austria for 20 years, which was a Catholic country, and spent a lot of time in Poland, which is one of my favorite countries in the world, from which the Pope John Paul came and was a tremendous international and intellectual presence and figure. Why is it important? I think the question is because you think of the Catholic Church as a 2,000-year-old, or maybe a little bit younger, but institution that has been around. And whatever we feel about the theological visions and our own particular stance, it has been a public face and representation of the Christian faith for these thousands of years, not in its initial, um, obviously, the fusion of Rome, but as it then journeyed through Europe, and Europe formed, sent out missionaries around the world, was for many years, apart from, of course, the Orthodox Church, the carrier of Christianity and the gospel around the world with a mixed bag, as it has been in all church mission activities around the world. I think the fact, though, is it has proclaimed from the beginning and to the present, a very clear vision of reality, which was founded from the gospel, the scriptures, the story of God, the creator, a moral universe, and of course, the supreme revelation of Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, the promised one, and then salvation through him, and a Trinitarian faith. Now, as evangelicals and Protestants, we will, of course, narrow that down to some sharper views on our side. But these are great historical, and they are philosophical and truths that are out there in the public square. So the Catholic Church, with all of its blots and blemishes and the human factor, if you like, has been a great public voice. And I think the value of that, and certainly as I go back to Pope John Paul, no doubt we'll come to him, um, as a public intellectual, as raising questions about euthanasia, abortion, the family, morality, justice, economy, from a metaphysical perspective, is a very valuable thing, and it keeps a conversation going that doesn't allow it to be dominated by purely secular, or for that matter, other voices like Islamic voices or even Hindu voices, which are now very, very prominent in the public square and should be. We're in a pluralist world.
Well, on that note, before we get to Pope John Paul II, whom you've already mentioned briefly, Dad, I wonder, a question then comes to mind. A lot of people, we're hearing a lot of news about how people are converting to both either, Catholicism or the Orthodox Church, these ancient traditions. Given what you said, you're talking about thousands of years of stability. You're talking about an illustrious intellectual tradition. So, for my part, even people I know who would seem to be fairly anti-Catholic in some sense in their sentiments, they would still quote Augustine, for instance, with enthusiasm, right? So there's a rich or the church fathers,
Thomas Aquinas,
of course, yeah, Thomas Aquinas. But my question is, and I think I'm very curious to hear your take on this because I think there's a bit of a grass is greener sort of thing taking place sometimes here as well. But is the Catholic Church uniquely poised to meet the unique challenges of our kind of modern
Mhm.
cultural moment in ways that the evangelical church or the Protestant church is not? The soundbite is, "Yes, absolutely, it's more ancient, it's more rooted." I would love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think I think the short answer to that is yes, in a way, because of the deep immersion in transcendence and history and the deep commitment to truths that are not necessarily fashionable, but are true. And so I think people go back now and begin to feel the modernity hollows out things. Evangelicals have, in Os Guinness's words, sometimes we follow what the homo up to datum. You know, they want to be sort of the fashionable, the cool, the relevant, and so we shape our missiology in our church around relevance, cool, around theater style churches, about Starbucks in the hall, motorbikes on the stage, blah blah blah, and that has all worn out because the consumerist kind of a materialist vision of life is not what people need or are looking for. And I think what something like Catholic and Orthodox, because there's a big turn to that too, is because of its seemingly unchangeableness. It's fixed, it's there, but it's also there's a certain sense of mystery, meaning, meaningfulness, and rootedness. So I think those are big things. Now, when you get into the theological fineries and what people are, I think because this is very existential, phenomenological, it's people's, there's a hunger for something missing. There's a thinness, a kind of a vaporousness to a lot of what passes as evangelical sound bites, morality, exhortations, do this, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot, much more sense of come before the mystery and worship and surrender fit in. Now it's not all perfect, but there's sometimes there's the attraction that's not real, but there is still something there that is real, that is calling, and I think there's something that's powerfully attractive to many.
Stuart, question, I don't have any perspective of this. So all of the Catholics that I know or that I spend time with, have largely been American. And it seems to me, is there a different feel, so to speak, to American Catholicism versus, Polish Catholicism, or the relative value of the Pope, so to speak? Because I know a lot of Catholics who have a whole lot of different opinions. They're like, "Well, the church says this, but not really. We can add this." There's variety, there's plurality among, and I'm like, I don't know if it works.
Yes, there's a huge difference between Catholics around the world. I mean, if you go to Italy, it's different. Poland, of course, Poland has a particular strong because they have a very particular, and of course, the Pope coming, they had a very strong version of Catholicism. They had a counter Reformation. It was pretty bloody and pretty vicious. You have in Latin America and Peru and other places, very, very strong Catholicism that also mixed with a lot, as it does with the local culture. So in America, you have people who are Americans first and Catholics second, just as you have Americans first who are evangelicals. So American and Americanness, individuality, my own right, self-definition, my freedom is first. So I don't care if there's a pope. If I want to have an abortion, I'll have an abortion. I don't care if there's contraception. If I have, because I'm an American. Now I happen to be a Catholic. And we saw that we've seen this played out on the political front in this country. And I think the American, Catholic, bishops have seen that. I mean, they know that in the international sphere, the challenges they face in this country, as do the others. But there's no, at least anything, there's no one stereotype of what a good,
Yeah.
a pure Catholic is. But there are obviously there's the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which John
Mhm.
Paul, I believe, renewed and modernized. Um, and so, yes, there's different versions, but still they have that there's a core from which this kinda message goes out, yeah.
Mhm. I was just wondering if that's one of the points of confusion, I think, for American Christians who I've just found myself as I look and like, what is the actual Catholic statement on XYZ topic? what's the theological justification for it, is oftentimes very different than the felt reality that I see. Because there's a little bit between orthodoxy and orthopraxy within Catholicism that I think leaves those who aren't engaging with the theological work part of it a little confused about what exactly is going
Well,
on.
I think that's a big point, Nathan, with a lot of these beliefs. I think because the Catholic Church is very definitive, and you can find its beliefs either on life or in their catechism or other things. So they're very, very clear, and they're updated. And you mean whether we think about it, it's there. But I think the problem is that people go in on a superficial level. They get attracted to the certain part. That's the same with Orthodoxy to some degree initially. It's the transcendence. It's the historical. There's an emotive pull and attractive, and they go, and they may still walk in intellectually committed once they read the material, that's fine. But there is material and there are differences. I think though, I think we're again going back to Pope John Paul, in this pluralistic world, this is the co-belligerency principle that was a very strong part of Francis Schaeffer, is a very useful thing. I know that in Europe, in the Evangelical Alliance, when I was general secretary, I would have to say that the greatest ally we find for information, ideas, and things was often the Catholic Church. It was sometimes the very liberal Protestants who were the most viciously against
Mm.
us and the Catholics. So, so secularism and modern liberal or progressivism, as we call it in this country, which is a version of the same thing, that's the issue, and that's what a lot of where the Catholic Church and the Orthodox stand out against, because here they stand in a modern world looking like dinosaurs, supposedly mocked for their historic faith, holding on to things that people think are past their sell-by date, but yet they call us to look up and look out and to take stock.
Yeah, on that note, a story that I shared with you actually yesterday, Dad, so maybe it won't be as annoying today, but when I went to small, sort of very culturally conservative undergrad Bible college, Pope John Paul II died while I was a student there, while I was a freshman. So I'm dating myself here. But I remember the response, there were a number of responses, but one that was very striking came from one professor in particular to this impressionable group of freshmen, basically speculating on the salvation of Pope John Paul II and letting us know on no uncertain terms that the prognosis was grim, so to speak. So that I think he spoke for a number of people. So I think part of what you can help us do is clear away some of the confusion there. You've already been doing that, but also help us to understand the general significance of John Paul II in particular. He's a man of major stature. And I think in recent years, I'm seeing from where I can see more and more Protestant theologians are gaining real appreciation for him. There was Lexham Press just put out a really good compilation celebrating the theology and the importance of John Paul II.
Yeah.
But just for our listeners, why is this man so important? Why is he worth paying attention to and reading?
Well, of course, he grew up in Poland, and he was I think, a teenager at the time of the outbreak of the Second World War. So he lived through the Nazis and managed to avoid that. And people don't realize that when the Nazis took over, particularly southern Poland, Krakow was the head of what became one of the major Nazi ruling areas and was the center, of course, of the Holocaust for many. He resisted to the Nazis and taught underground priests and was involved in church and activities. And after the war, of course, he learned by seeing that he became very much because Poland fell under the communists right immediately after the Nazis. So he had a visceral reaction against totalitarianism of any kind, and he also, I mean, I believe he had two doctorates, but he was moral philosophy was one of his strong points. So he helped to pastor the church, to be the church, and I know people that were close to him in Krakow, the Baptist pastor, who would often do things with him, or he would invite guest speakers or people to come. So there was a kind of a sharing back and forward because the common threat was communism and the eradication of churches of all kinds, no matter what shape. But the fighting for human rights, for dignity, for freedom, for moral authority and clarity, protecting the family, all of those things that he developed as a priest, then as a cardinal, and stood out fairly courageously in a line of resistance. But then through his teaching and his training when he was elected pope, of course, he did that internationally. So he taught I mean, he had regular lectures, I think, that were then circulated, I believe. But he also, in his travel, I think he was one of the most traveled popes, and he'd often speak about human rights. He was anti the death penalty. He fought particularly in Latin America, where liberation theology was a big
Mhm.
thing at that time, which was a form of Marxism invading theology. Apartheid, he stood against apartheid very strongly and rights in the African countries. But it was clearly in Europe, particularly, that it had the greatest effect, not least because of the coalition of figures with Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and other factors, and of course Gorbachev when he came along, that were features. But it was his stand that gave Poland a leverage that no other country
Mhm.
had, you know?
So walk us through then, because I would say we don't see that from the Pope now.
No.
What's so was he unique in his character, unique in his role? Why? Um,
Well,
again, speak to the totally Catholic uneducated here. I mean, and I was just thinking as you were saying, Cameron, I was just pulling off the shelf. Our bodies tell God's story.
yeah.
Here's a
Yeah.
Christopher West, Eric Metaxas, uh, forwarded book on Pope John Paul II's theology of the body. And so that would be another reference of, a place where evangelicals or the broader church world is working off of some theological or intellectual philosophical work of a previous pope. Will that be true of Pope Francis or
No, I
it
think
feels different?
you reckon and it is different because just like in if you get a pastor in a church, or say you have one of the mainline Protestant churches, and a person of a more progressive persuasion takes the pulpit or takes over the seminary, that what may have been a conservative institution tied to pretty strong biblical and other values can then widen its remit and embrace all kinds of things. Well, the same with the Catholic Church. If the Pope has that enormous power, and I think the pope that was laterally elected was of a much more liberal and wide-ranging persuasion on many of the social issues. In fact, John Paul would be a conservative, and of course, Ratzinger before him,
Mhm.
who was a theologian and was also a conservative. And people say, although this is the problem, if you have a black and white, a binary, everything, and you look at the Catholic Church with one great block, that's a fundamental mistake. It's very different. It's
Hmm.
diversified. It has a core, but it also depends on the leadership. And where it is now is in the much more liberal, and many Catholics themselves are weary of that. They struggle with it. That's why there's been so much
Mhm,
political fighting, because this Pope has
Mhm.
gone after more causes that would be more sympathetic with. I mean, the other Pope would have been horrified, I'm quite sure, by some of the things that have been said. So that happens in institutions. But still, they're out there, and of course the church will, when this pope dies, another will be elected, and that's why it'll be interesting, where they go in the next
mhm.
phase.
Well,
But
it
it's Catholic influence then gets changed or gets morphed a bit.
it used to be, the punchline of a joke of, it was a joke of somebody being more Catholic than the Pope. And then, here in the last several years, I've run into people, I'm like, "I think they think they are more Catholic than the Pope."
Yeah.
It's not a joke anymore. Could you just I know Cameron wants to jump in here. Could you quickly define what would be the defining parameters when you use the word conservative or liberal Pope, what's the distinction there?
Well, I think that the distinction is that that a conservative holds much more to the classic theology of the church, and may have looked at Vatican II, but even there was a sort of a revised Vatican II, which was more, and again, John Paul was more in the conservative version. Now, he encouraged Vatican II, so there was a liberalization of some of the teachings, but he still held to the majority of Catholic central teaching on the family, on the Trinity, on conversion, on aspects of the responsibility, authority of the church, on men and women, the role of male, female, and these type of things. A liberal, like a liberal elsewhere, would be for opening up the priesthood, and maybe endorsing women as priests. maybe endorsing gay marriage and all these type of things. All the normal causes that you see elsewhere would be part, I think, of the liberalization process, and just as it would be probably
Okay.
on the conservative side, somewhat similar.
All right. Well, you kind of anticipated my next question, but I'd like you to amplify a bit. So, Alistair McIntyre kind of has a good way of thinking about tradition, where he talks about tradition as sort of a sustained, successful argument
Mhm.
down, in some cases, down centuries. And and one of the major tensions for us as Christians is we're really with this massive phenomenon we call modernity, however it's defined. So I would like you to talk a little bit more about Vatican II in particular, because I think to date, that's the most dramatic picture of the Catholic Church really wrestling with what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a Catholic right now in this modern moment? And what was some of maybe just some of the impetus behind that? What were some of the decisions? You mentioned a more conservative side and a more liberal side. Maybe talk a little bit about that because that's a central dividing line, obviously, up until today.
And please do
I'm
it
not sure that I'm not sure I'm greatly qualified to talk. Let me give a shot at this as best I can. I think part of what you've got to look at realize is that so the Vatican II took place in the 60s, but that was the fruit of the Second World War was still cascading. You were now in the Cold War. So there's two big things. The World War II that had killed over 60, 70 million people. And many of those countries involved in that were Catholic countries. And of course, there was the question of the Holocaust and the complicity. It was often blamed that the Catholic Church was somewhat, sometimes it's been tarred or blamed with giving refuge to Nazis after the war and this kind of thing. Of course, that also has to be seen in the context of the Cold War then
Mhm.
and so forth. So not justifying anything, just looking at it as
Yeah.
data points, if you like. The Cold War then brought a whole bunch of things to bear. So I think what was happening, you had new social political realities in which the church that formerly had power and freedom, all of that was gone away again. Now we were back under totalitarian system in which the church had to live its life, catechize its members, baptize people, and live under the conditions of secularism or control or domination, or in many cases outright persecution. The question also then came up with the rise of modern technologies that were changing family economies and all kinds of things. So, as you said, the church has at this 2,000-year tradition of history of materials and ideas that now had to be translated. You know, tradition has to be translated
Mhm.
into the present time. So there were theological questions of the moment and moral questions of huge import that were becoming on responsibility to the state, responsible again, marriage, abortion, the new sexuality of the 60s, and all of this.
Mhm.
What was the church? And the often response when you're unsure is a knee jerk no. But obviously, intellectual people and the church was trying to do, we need to answer these questions. We need to have an answer. So that's where I think Vatican II and those kind of things was to try and modernize the church, to bring her up to date, to make her pronouncements clear, but also to deal with, if you like, post-Reformation issues in too, because the ecumenism was a big issue in the global world. You needed other churches. And many of the churches were reaching out to each other, and the popes, the Catholic Church, was sympathetic to an ecumenism of trying to get together. And of course, people always get nervous about that. But the point was to try and find each other for conversation, for interaction, and for the responsibility against all these oppositional forces that were clearly anti-Christian and Christianly violent and sometimes committed to the destruction of the church.
And I mean,
So
just a
a very common, yeah.
yeah, I mean, and just a word of sympathy. I mean, there's always that fine line between translation and capitulation. I know we talk or the contextualization is another word that makes scares a lot of people, but the fact was, okay, if you're a Catholic in, 1960s Boston or Chicago, I mean, do you really wanna be going to a Latin mass? I mean, there comes a point where some of those decisions where I mean, and I can't fully put myself in the shoes of, Catholics for whom this was the loss of something so momentous, but I think we can all understand a little bit. I mean, in other words, that's not unique to Catholicism. We as Protestants have to we I mean, I think one analog would be the worship wars that we've had down the years where we're trying to figure out, okay, what's the line between something that's contemporary enough to draw so that not draw people in, but allow people to participate, I suppose, and then others who just cherish, old souls like me, for instance, who or people who grew up with hymns and all of that. But I'm just yeah, that's just to state that none of this is if we say Vatican II, it might sound exotic, but it's not. This is
No,
something that everybody struggles with.
it's going exactly. I mean, so we all struggle. We are human beings. Some human beings hate change, and some they don't want
Right.
to live without anything else but change. So that's a very human thing. So, but change is necessary in the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. I mean, the ecumenical. I mean, think about the Protestant churches. Think about the Anglicans in Britain, the Lutherans in Germany. The Germans are dealing with the Holocaust and the fact of the complicity of the Reich Church that was under the Nazis, and then the confessing church that was separate from, and all of these. And so then they're trying to rebuild, and they're looking at the sheer devastation of Europe. I mean, it was and there were millions of people in Germany that had to be relocated. There was this massive destruction. Everything had to rebuild, and the churches, of course, are there on the ground. They're in local communities, try to feed people, talk to them, and of course, there's a missional imperative. How do we? And people are going to be asking the problem of evil. Which church? Did I go to that church? Were you with the Nazis? Are you sympathetic to the communists? So there was an awful lot of work that had to be done to regain and minister to people, as well as if you like, defend or sort the church's public face and her
Mhm.
status on all sides. And the Catholic Church was in that, as were all the others at the same time.
So, Stuart, as you're talking about the Catholic Church having this history of kind of the public face, multinational, like global perspective, and this continuous attempt to engage new cultures and civilizations, you have the whole, like you were mentioning, the South American conquest conversion story narrative there. You have, I think, a high degree of syncretism between cultures in the Catholic Church at various points. Then Vatican II kind of being the expression of that movement in the modern era of translating. And you look at things that went well. You look at where I want to go with this is what is the value to a non-Catholic of looking at the history and the experience of the Catholic Church as we think about how we want to make some of
Mhm.
those decisions for ourselves in the second quarter of the 21st century.
Well, I think it's a very helpful. I mean, that's why when I was in Europe, I mean, I remember picking up a couple of times and almost a kind of strange feeling when I picked up. I was in a bookstore and there was one of the Pope's encyclicals that came round, and it was incredibly useful. And again, as a Protestant evangelical, I mean, the tone was different. There were things I didn't agree with in general, but what I appreciated was his perspective, his orientation, and I felt within the broad aspects of Christendom that I understood, what he was saying, and I could see how I might tighten things or whatever. But it certainly was very, very useful or insightful. I think that I mean, there's in 2,000 years of their history, there's not much that they haven't faced in terms of mistakes and strengths made around the world in mission and so forth, and all the counter movements from the Jesuits and all the Franciscans and the monasteries, the questions of spirituality, questions of public relevance, and all of this type of thing. It's not only been done; it's pretty well documented out there. So sometimes they're good sources. I do know, and this is, I mean, it was just a fact that so when we were working in Brussels and we had an office and we were trying to get some information and insight, moral theology, if you like, to respond to things that were beginning to come through the countries of European Union. A researcher, Lady Julia Doxat Purser, found that because of the Catholic universities, you had access, and they would freely let you have access to this, studies going on, PhDs or research that was moral theology that was, we often had and you may have could find it somewhere tucked away in some evangelical seminary somewhere, a little piece of it, but they had a much wider remit. Of course, they had resources, and it was often very, very useful. It was very insightful, very thoughtful, and got the questions clear and the things that had to be done and looked at. So I think there's a lot to learn. I mean, the point of being, if I'm a confessing evangelical Christian, and I am, I know where I stand for a reason, and I within my tradition, and I love the tradition I stand in, and I confess that unreserved, and I can, but I don't thereby take a superiority or a negative or what's the word, a hostile view to these other people. I
Mm.
think we deal with the question that arises. What I try to have a sympathetic listening, as I would expect from them of us, but try to learn where you can learn and then sift and say, well, I see that up to a point, but I wouldn't embrace it that way. I would move beyond it, or I might not believe it at all. But I can be sympathetic in my listening. And I think there's much to learn from some of these people who are dabbling in very much the same territory as we all are, because we're human.
People often will say, "What's a really good book for us all that you would recommend for everybody from the person?" But I actually don't like that question because everybody is different. We people who have tuned in enjoy hearing you and they like your sensibilities, Stuart, i.e., Dad. So let me ask you, what is a book by John Paul II that you personally have found to be the most beneficial, the most helpful in your thinking? I think our listeners would love to hear about that. And maybe you need to mull that over for a second. He's
I probably do, Cameron. I can't remember because it's been, with my reading. I mean, that's what when you guys asked me to do this, you caught me off guard because it's been obviously been here for so long now. It's been
mhm,
a time. I mean, oh gosh, there was one of his. It was one of his latter books that was to do with on humanity, and it was a kind of phenomenological. Look, I can't even remember the title now. Um,
we
but
will
it really
hunt it down and put it in our show notes,
Yes,
so no worries.
because his books were very much about the human and the moral, and he had done so much thinking on that, and I think what was good was because he could do it. I remember at the time we were working on this theology of hope, and that there was a very hopeful element in that. That was partly of what he was doing because it had the transcendent anchor, but it was against the policy and political and philosophical statements then very, very dominant in Europe, and holding up again this kind of a almost prophetic lens against that. So I think, yeah, I wish I'm sorry didn't have that at my fingertips, but, um,
Oh, we'll have it, don't worry.
yeah, okay.
There's a funny element to that, Stuart, of you talking about, walking into the university to find the research. Um, so clearly a pre-internet age where you couldn't
Yeah.
just go out and Google, the PhD thesis, or had, a subscription to all the uh, doctoral work that's going on in the world at any given time. So definitely a different era. And I think, this conversation largely fits under the umbrella of Thinking Out Loud's approach to a whole number of different resources. So I think, well, yeah, could we do a podcast on 101 reasons why we're not Catholic? Sure. But
Yeah.
that's
Oh,
not
yeah.
what we're doing. We're just saying, here's some valuable things to be thinking about. Uh,
But if you look at historical figures, and I mean, you can select various people, but I mean, anybody who likes biographies and histories, then the biography of John Paul II is a wonderful story in
Mm,
itself
mhm.
because if it looks at his historical and particularly a history of the 20th century from the time uh, from when he was born to when he died, I think 2005 or around there. But he lived through those years. He saw the collapse of communism. He lived and he achieved a lot. So again, understand the man, the setting, and all of that, and then we see some of the riches and the treasures, even as we filter, as we do with anyone, the things that we think are relevant and the things that we pass on, so
Well,
go
this was hey, do you wanna take it, Nathan?
no, land it, Cameron.
Yeah. Well, this has been a wonderful discussion as always, and one we'll likely return to again because many interesting things are happening with the Catholic Church right now, and of course, with the current pope bringing to light a number of these interesting tensions. So, thank you, Dad, for talking about this and yes, helping us to see a more holistic perspective of this topic, and yeah, maybe help us some of us to think more seriously about not just thinking about Catholicism, but maybe talking with our Catholic brothers and sisters and having those rich dialogues. But you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.tolconnect.org. toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.